You know all there is to know about fighting. So there's no sense us going down that same old road again. To beat this guy, you need speed. You don't have it. And your knees can't take the pounding. So hard running is out. And you got arthritis in your neck. And you've got calcium deposits on most of your joints. So sparring is out.
I had that problem.
So what we'll be calling on is good old-fashioned blunt force trauma. Horsepower. Heavy-duty, cast-iron, pile-driving punches that will have to hurt so much they'll rattle his ancestors. Every time you hit him with his shot, it's got to feel like he tried kissing the express train. Yeah, let's start building some hurting bombs.
Back to Pantheon Plus here on the Real World Podcasting Network. On this episode tonight, we are going to be discussing the sixth Rocky movie entitled Rocky Balboa. My name is Jerome Cuson, and you can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. Please make sure you leave a 4 or 5 star review on your favorite podcasting platform so to help people discover the great work that we are doing here at the Real World. My co-host is Brian. You can find him on Twitter at BrianDeBrain. And we are continuing with our theme of underrated sequels. We have already gone through all 4 of Brian's underrated sequels. Now we are going to be hitting the last 3 are mine, and we are going to be starting with the 6th movie in the Rocky franchise. And we have certainly talked a little bit about the Creed movies and definitely discuss those a bit, but this is a kind of an opportunity to talk about Sylvester Stallone, somebody that Brian and I have seen a lot of his movies. We've only really briefly talked about him when we talked about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, but this is our opportunity to kind of fully envelop ourselves in who Sylvester Stallone is, and it's gonna be an interesting conversation because Sylvester Stallone is very much known for his action movies, and when the first Rocky came out, he was a struggling screenwriter, and it was a question of whether he was going to even be able to become a movie star. And then he became one of the biggest action stars of the 1980s, and his career kind of took a significant downturn in the 90s and the 2000s to the point where he changed his career trajectory a little bit by doing a movie like Copland, and now he is a little bit more. This is a very different movie, I would say, than the Rocky sequels that came prior, especially and most notably Rocky IV. But Brian, are you excited to talk about the Rocky franchise?
Yeah, we almost debated whether or not we should do the rankings, but I think we're going to save that for a special episode. Because if I were to rank Rocky Balboa, it'd probably be in the top 4. But yeah, and I would even say, I would say Rocky IV and the director's cut of Rocky IV that just came out. I would do 2 separate entries in that list, but we can talk about that another time. But yeah, this movie, when it first came out, I was kind of in shock. I saw the trailer when Pirates of the Caribbean 2 came out in 2006. So it was the summer of 2006, and the whole audience was just looking at each other. I remember looking at my friend and did we just see a trailer for a new Rocky movie in 2006? And then, of course, the buzz started picking up afterward, and then it came out in December of that year. But it wasn't this big, huge box office success that Creed was. And I think people were kind of taken aback by it because it was just kind of whoa, we're getting another Rocky movie, and the dude's 60 years old and he's still boxing at the end of the movie. But then I think when it came out on DVD and the rentals, because I was working at Blockbuster at the time, a lot of people rented this movie, and I remember talking to a lot of people about this movie at the time. And I watched it on DVD. I didn't have a chance to watch it in theaters, and when I watched it on DVD with some friends of mine, it was a different experience because we were kind of marking out for wow, they got HBO boxing to do the production for the fight. And I know you're not really a fan of the fighting, especially in this movie and the way it's shot, but at the time, me and my friends were like, wow, HBO boxing, that's like kind of like a legit thing. And the way they tied it in and the way they switched the cameras for the third act when they went to the the sports cameras for the fight, we were kind of taken aback by that. We loved that stuff. And then, you know, of course, we love the stuff with the restaurant and all that kind of thing. But I think the thing that really got us was like Rocky coming back and doing a fight at 60 years old. And we were just kind of questioning everything. But the way they kind of put it together, it was like a stroke of luck in the fight, so to speak, that allowed Rocky to go into 10 rounds. But still, like, I think this movie has a lot to offer. I wish there wasn't a fight at the end, but again, it's just kind of like hindsight's 2020, because obviously the best stuff is Rocky in the restaurant, or when he's talking with his kid, or when he's on the sidewalk, just being this community hero. And I kind of forgot that he became this like community hero, like to like kids with like no parents or whatever. He's kind of taking them in and shepherding them, kind of thing. And there are people that do that in like urban areas that are kind of tough. And you hear these stories about, oh, this great person he looked out for us, or she looked out for us when we were young because, we didn't have any parents, or blah, blah, blah. And that's kind of what the role of Rocky's in right now. And I really like that. Like, I didn't realize that the first time I watched it years ago, but now it's like, yeah, he's this kind of like guy that's looking out for the community. And he's like, he's got this money, but he probably spent most of it. It looks like the way the excess from Rocky 4 and 3 are gone. And he's like back in the hood. You know what I mean? So he's probably got some money left, not a lot left. He's running this restaurant, but he's like giving like money away. You know what I mean? It's like he does this selfless stuff. So I was really enjoying that stuff. I just wish that this movie didn't have a fight at the end.
I think if they had found a way to not have a fight at the end, I think it would have made for a much better experience. And it's clear that that Sylvester Stallone wanted to have an official fight, because he saw how people reacted to the end of Rocky 5, which just like Bruno and Encanto, we're really not going to talk about Rocky 5, but let's talk about kind of how this movie came together. So originally, Adrian Balboa, as played by Talia Shire, Adrian was alive in the first few drafts, and Robert Balboa was in the U.S. Air Force. The early title for this movie was Rocky Six Puncher's Chance, which, boy, oh boy, what a terrible title that is, if that actually came to fruition. And then at some point, Sylvester Stallone and Talia Shire came to the decision that for the emotional impact to really be felt in this movie, that it would be best for Adrian to die of ovarian cancer. And that is exactly what happened. And while it sucks that we did not get Talia Shire, I think it's really for the best, because I think her character was never well written, especially in the sequels. I think just the way that she was in the first one, I think is the best version, even though I think it's also very problematic. But I just don't think that character ever really clicked. And I think killing her off in some ways was the right call. The most amusing thing to me is that Sylvester Stallone had not directed a movie since Rocky 4, 21 years earlier, which I find to be very, very interesting. So kind of going 21 years between movies, and you look at his career and kind of what he was doing. This is a guy who directed Rocky 2. He directed the sequel to Saturday Night Fever, Urban Cowboy, which I find to be really fascinating. And he wasn't even in that movie. Like, this is a point when he's one of the biggest.
Staying Alive.
Staying Alive.
Presence. I know that.
It's wild to me that Sylvester Stallone directed that sequel, but wasn't in it. Like, obviously he shouldn't be in it, but it's crazy to me. And then he does Rocky 3, Rocky 4, and then really doesn't direct. Obviously a very powerful influence, but he's very much kind of doing the Rambo sequels and Cliffhanger, Demolition Man, Judge Dredd, some of the highlights of his career. He had trouble getting a lot of funding for this movie because Rocky 5 did not do very well at the box office, and it received very, very bad reviews by everybody involved across the board. It didn't work, and that's really all that can be said about it. And you should never watch Rocky 5. Anyone should never do this. In terms of your thoughts on kind of Sylvester Stallone's trajectory, maybe some brief thoughts on Rocky 5, and anything else before we gotta get into the production aspects.
Yeah, Adrian was never like a well-written character because it's obvious that Stallone is this alpha male and he comes from like this era of the '70s where if you just have this male protagonist, you just write around him, and then the female characters would kind of become serviceable to the male character, and that's what it was in the Rocky movies. Um, but he did win an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay, so it's just kind of this thing where it's like maybe he thinks he's this great writer, even though he's a good writer. You know what I mean? And then when he tries to write female characters, it just doesn't work. Because like even the female character in this one, she was just there servicing Rocky's character. She didn't really have an arc for herself. So yeah, it's just kind of one of those things that's one of his weaknesses in terms of writing. But in terms of him, like in his career trajectory, like I just recently watched Cobra, and that's entertaining for what it is, even though the script is just utterly terrible. But it was entertaining. He didn't direct that one. But, like in the 90s, like I did like his work in the 90s. It's like I do like parts of Judge Dredd when we reviewed it. I do like Demolition Man. I like most of Cliffhanger. I even like Assassins, which people don't really like. But if you're looking for a movie where Antonio Banderas is just acting out of his mind and trying to be the Joker and even doing like Heath Ledger Joker type stuff, I would totally recommend Assassins. And Julianne Moore is just kind of there having fun again, like in Lost World. But it works for what it is, even though the plot is really ridiculous. But Stallone is kind of like the calm guy in that movie, and he actually makes that movie work. So I would recommend Assassins. Um, you mentioned Copland. We'll have to discuss it another day because I didn't finish Copland. Like it's just one of those things where Michael Rappaport sticks his head out and makes the whole movie at that point totally unbelievable for me. Because why would you do that if you're just on the run killing this dude and you stick your head out and Stallone sees you on purpose? We could talk about that another time. But Copland started out well, and then that one moment just kind of ruined it for me, and I just didn't watch the whole movie after that. But Stallone's career was kind of like on a downturn at this point. But if you notice, Rocky Balboa brought him back because after this, he got the directing job for Expendables, which he produced and wrote and whatnot. And then after this was another Rambo movie, which was okay. It was violent, but it was okay, and it made its money back and it had some profit. And I remember a lot of people renting that too at the time at Blockbuster. So this movie did help his career again. This is kind of like his second coming. And it feels like we're kind of still in this like second era of Stallone because even after Creed, like he's still doing like directing stuff and like he's doing more action movies. And there's another Expendables movie coming out. So, this era from 2006 to now, I think is kind of like his not second renaissance, so to speak, but like his, he was gone out of the public spotlight from about, I would say 98, 97-ish to about 2006. And then from this point on, he's been in the public eye and he's stuck with the Creed thing and Creed 1 and 2. And then he's doing Guardians and these small cameos. He's going to be in the third one. Hopefully he has a lot more lines. That'd be really nice. But overall, I think, that period between 99 and 2006, that was the time when you kind of make fun of Stallone for being like, that crazy action 80s hero guy. And then all of a sudden he has this comeback with Rocky Balboa.
Yeah, I would say a lot of what you say is true. And I think for me, what's so interesting is that Arnold Schwarzenegger was clearly like the top dog of the 80s and the 90s in terms of action heroes and that sort of thing. But if you look at kind of the second half of their careers, I would argue Sylvester Stallone has had a much greater impact. And I think his career in the second half has been much better. I would say, after in the 2000s, you get Rocky Balboa, you get the Expendables franchise, which I kind of have mixed feelings about, but you can't argue that it's been very successful. Almost winning an Oscar for Creed, which I think he should have won. Being a part of Creed 2, he's got a show on Paramount Plus, The Tulsa King, so he's still been around. And yes, Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor of California, but it just never felt like Arnold Schwarzenegger, even after he came back. And he did a couple Terminator movies, he's done a couple of action things, and it hasn't worked out nearly as well. And yeah, that's kind of where I come down on it. But in terms of looking at the production of this movie was shot in about 38 days, and they actually shot the fight between Mason the Line Dixon, played by Antonio Tarver, and Stallone first, because Stallone had to get himself in really good shape, and that's exactly what he did. He may or may not have used substances to help, but That's alleged. There's we won't engage in that level of rumor mongering, but it's definitely very possible.
I'll say this: in 2006, let's just say he probably would have passed some drug tests that he would not have passed in 2023 with these new regulations, with especially the Nevada State Commission, because the Nevada State Commission is known for doing some really iffy things, but also passing people at the possible times that they needed it, like in UFC and stuff like that. Otherwise, their fights would have been out the window and people would have lost money. So we know what the Nevada State Commission does.
So originally, Sylvester Stallone was once again going to cast his son Sage Stallone in the role. And look, it's tough to talk about this because Sage Stallone is unfortunately no longer with us. But he, in Rocky V, he was definitely a very weak point in the movie, and I think casting him it wouldn't have worked. I think casting who they did, I think was ultimately the right decision. And look, you can't get around the fact that a lot of what you see between Rocky and Robert, it feels like it could very easily be between some of the issues between Robert and his son. But again, Sage is no longer with us, so I don't really want to dive too much into that. But what I can say is, in terms of the screenplay and some of the deleted scenes, Clubber Lang and Ivan Drago originally had cameo appearances. Clubber would have been a ringside commentator for the bout and making disparaging remarks about Rocky. I think that would have been pretty amusing, actually. I kind of wanted to see that. There was also a scene with Ivan Drago. Rocky apparently was going to visit him in a hospital, and Drago was going to be dying of AIDS from steroid abuse. And boy, oh boy, this scene would have got really dark because Rocky would have told the nurse, if he dies, he dies. The same line that Drago said about Apollo Creed in the fourth movie. I gotta say, I'm really glad we did not see that did not make the final cut. I'm glad that wasn't even shot, because that sounds terrible. And I think what they did in Creed 2 with the Drago family works much better.
God, that's so bad, because it seems like he's trying to recreate the death of the Tommy guy from Rocky V. The actual, I forget his last name, but the guy that played Tommy, like, that's actually how he died, I think. So it's weird that he takes these like real life scenarios and tries to put him in the movie. Stallone does, but like, man, it's just like sometimes he doesn't realize like context and tone, and like that would have been such a dark tone. And I think that would have been a disservice to the Drago character, because clearly now when you watch Creed 2, that guy was like not really the villain of Rocky 4 that he was portrayed at originally. He's just a victim. And I like that fact that they kind of portrayed that in Creed 2. Otherwise, I mean, yeah, this would have been just ugly to watch, and just like, ugh, yeah, that would have been a total disservice, especially what they did when they redeemed his character in Creed 2, for sure.
There's a point when Rocky was stalking a woman that looked like Adrian, which, boy, oh boy, that wouldn't have worked either. The movie was based on a George Foreman-Michael Moorer fight that took place in 1994. George Foreman had retired from boxing in 1977, but in 1987, he came back, and he was 38 years old in 1994. He was 45 years old, taking on the 26-year-old heavyweight champion at the time. Moorer decided that he was going to mess around with Foreman, was outboxing him, and then going into the 10th round, Foreman was trailing on all the scorecards. But as is wont to happen in boxing, you get one good punch in and you knock somebody out, and that's what happens. Is Foreman won on a TKO. So really interesting. Again, just as the first Rocky was kind of based on the Chuck Wetner story, and that has gone into litigation as well, this is also based on some reality. I think something else that is interesting about this movie is, and we'll talk more about the Marie character a little bit when we get into the story, but I just want to point this out, that Pedro Lovell once again plays Spider Rico. Spider Rico was the first boxer that we see Rocky defeat in the opening scene of the 1976 movie. And it's a really great shout out. Poor Spider Rico, not doing it nearly as well as Rocky. So, but it's good that Rocky is treating one of his former competitors well. And Brian, I know you love this. Take You Back, the song which opens the movie, was first performed by Frank Stallone on a street corner in the original movie. And I have to say that it really centers this movie and makes it feel like this feels like a direct sequel to the first one. And clearly the events of 2, 3, 4, and 5 have happened, but this, I think, captures the original better than any of the other sequels have.
Yeah, it grounded it. You know what I mean? Like, if you look at 2 through 4, the soundtracks become more 80s excess, and that's fine because, like, Rocky 4 is one of the, in my opinion, one of the top 5 greatest soundtracks of all time, because people still rock that shit today in gyms and like sporting events and stuff like that. Like, Rocky 4's soundtrack is iconic, but the first soundtrack for Rocky 1 is so much more grounded than people realize, and like, there's less of that disco type stuff they tried in the Rocky 2 soundtrack and the third one too. It's just more like street level, and that's what I think I loved about the opening credits of this movie. Is just like, oh, we're getting back to that street level Rocky where he was like, on the streets and doing like, being like he wasn't an assassin, but he was kind of like this, hitman, not a hitman, but the muscle for some of the local mob bosses back in the first movie. So they brought me to that like level of Rocky, and like that's what I think that's what we needed in this franchise. Like, if somehow 5 could have recreated that, which I think it tried to do but failed miserably, because it was trying to recreate the magic of the first one while doing the excess of the previous sequels, which that's where it failed. And this one, they're just trying to make like that feeling of the original again. And I love that opening sequence. And look, Frank Stallone, whether you like his music or not, if you're a wrestling fan from the 80s, you probably don't even realize that he had the Starcade. He was like the guy who sang the Starcade theme from like 84 to like 86, that Starcade theme they would use. It was a Frank Stallone song, and I think it came from the Staying Alive soundtrack. So there you go. And another quick wrestling connection. I don't know if you remember this, Jerome, but remember when they were trying to push Bob Backlund as this legend coming back to win the title in like 93 and 94? They were doing it because Foreman was on his run at the time. And when Foreman won the title, they were like, oh, I guess we got to give Bob Backlund the title. And that's when they gave Bob Backlund the fucking title for like 2 nights until Diesel beat him at the Garden. But that was the whole idea. Like, Bob Backlund was supposed to be this babyface legend coming back, but it backfired because everyone loved Bret and everyone just forgot about Bob Backlund. So then it became the crazy heel, but he still won the title at like 45 years old and lost in like 2 days. But still, like, that's kind of where that storyline comes from. Like, people don't really realize that. Like, that's why in 93 they were doing those videos for him and whatnot, and then people just forgot about him and they just kind of like threw it to the side. So funny how that kind of works out. But the thing is, though, is like Balboa was 60 years old, not 45 years old. So I think that's a major difference. But like, it's still like, I don't know. I think we'll get into it when we get to the commission thing. But goddamn, 60 years old, like, I don't know, man. That's pushing it.
I mean, you said I don't necessarily have a lot of knowledge about the Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission, but I could tell you there are some athletic commissions that have questionable practices at
like
this.
I mean, Nevada, especially. I mean, they had to fight in Nevada, meaning they had to honor the Pennsylvania State Commission's ruling, which they did, obviously. But still, like, there's still like these regulations and stuff. I don't know if they just brushed over it because in 2006, that's kind of what UFC at the time was doing, just kind of brushing over some of those, regulations and those drug testing. But I don't know, man, because like 60 years old, you're really pushing it with a lot of things. Like, but then again, I say that, and you look at Sting right now, who's wrestling 3 or 4 times a year in these like awesome like tag matches for the fans and like these nostalgia runs. So I don't know. And he's 63 right now, and he's like going to wrestle as of this recording. He's wrestling in Japan for the Great Muda's gimmick last match. So I don't know, man. I question things, but at the same time, like, maybe Stallone did get like these like stem cell research injections that were controversial at the time, but now a lot of these older athletes are doing it, and they're kind of like, look at Sting, you know what I mean? So it's questionable, but you got to feel for the guy at 60 years old. It's very on the line for me on this movie.
I think this is right on the cusp of really us understanding concussion and brain research, because the whole gimmick of Rocky 5 was that he suffered a lot of brain damage because he took a lot of hits to the head. And if you watch those fights, you would see that Rocky did, in fact, take a lot of hits to the head. And there's just no way that this would be taken seriously, especially because of what we know about concussions and brain damage. Like Rocky Balboa, and it's a movie, so I don't want this to make it seem like I didn't like this movie, because I really like this movie, and I picked this as an underrated sequel for a reason. But if we're looking at this in any sort of realistic way, this is just completely ridiculous and implausible, and you kind of have to accept it and move on. That's really all I can say about that.
Yeah, it's just, because when I watch this movie, I can't help but think of Daniel Bryan. Like, as much as I love seeing Daniel Bryan wrestle now, like, I still feel like I get scared when I watch his matches, because I feel like something bad might happen because of his past history. But he's like not even 40 yet, so it's really like questionable. You know what I mean? And you talk about the Rocky 5 stuff. Allegedly, from what I read in this other interview that like Stallone had about that issue, his argument was that at the time of Rocky 5, when they were making it, they didn't understand his concussions and brain damage as much as we do now, right? Or in 2006 at least. So his argument is that the doctor told him that he possibly could have brain damage, right? Possibly. And throughout the years, he stopped fighting, and then he did the test for the Pennsylvania State Commission, and he passed them. So obviously, what he's trying to write is that he didn't necessarily have brain damage. He had possible brain damage because he stopped at that point in time in 1990 in the timeline, that his brain just, got healed itself pretty much. And I don't know if that's total bullshit or whatnot, but I don't know. You look at a guy like Sting, and after all the crazy injuries he's had, especially that match with Seth Rollins, and he's coming back 4 times a year now. I just
Sting
don't know.
Sting doesn't have concussion issues necessarily. I think that's the big difference.
Yeah, his is more neck related. I get that, but still, it's like, it's very questionable. You know what I mean? I don't know the extent of like stem cell research now or whatever, but you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if a 60-year-old Rocky, I don't know. That's why that commission scene is really like sticks with me a lot. But
I mean, it was supposed to be longer, and I think the best thing they did was cut it down, because getting from point A to point C, that's the point, and that point B, it's probably best that you keep it to a minimum. And I think they focused on the Rocky speech and what he was saying, and that's really that's what you want. So kind of at the beginning of this movie, Rocky's wife Adrian has passed, and Rocky's really struggling to find a purpose in the second half of his life. He maintains, I would say, a small and humble home in the Philadelphia area. The same turtles from Rocky 1 are also in this movie, so I find that to be really cool. He owns a restaurant, which is called Adrian's, which was established in 1995. It is intimate, but also has a following because it's Rocky Balboa owning a restaurant. And again, I think the best moments of this movie are in and around the restaurant. I love the scene when he's picking out food. I think that's a really great scene to just like center us as Rocky is a part of Philadelphia again, and not like this big Hollywood celebrity. And I think when the sequels got to be their most ridiculous, it was getting Rocky farther and farther away from being like the neighborhood guy. And I think this is it's pretty fantastic stuff. So I want to focus on kind of the relationship that he has with kind of 3 different people. And the first one I want to talk about is his son and kind of the struggles that he has with Robert. Robert is played by Emilio Ventimiglia, who is probably best. So it's funny, if you ask who Emilio Ventimiglia is, you'll probably get This Is Us, probably is for some people. For others, it's Gilmore Girls. And for you and me, Brian, it's probably Rocky Balboa. Like, this is probably the first
well,
time.
I was a Heroes fan, man, and
how could I forget Heroes? Yeah,
I stuck with it despite me not liking that last couple seasons. I stuck with it, but boy, they set him up to be this really awesome character. And then for some reason, when season 2 hit, let's just reset all the characters and just try to redo everything from the first one, even though we already established in the first season that he's this great, awesome hero with awesome powers. Let's just reset everything. So that's my feeling.
We're not going to litigate Heroes. I mean, the writer's strike, I think, kind of ruined that show, but it sucks. And the show never really, I don't think that show ever realized its full potential. But I think in terms of the performances of Emilio and Sylvester Stallone, I think they did a really great job here. We see Robert in an early scene getting yelled at by his boss. He's a corporate lawyer, and then Rocky comes in and the boss is super nice to him. One of the things that I noticed about this scene, Brian, that I really appreciated is that Rocky does not call out the boss for yelling at his son. And I really like that because Rocky is he's trying to let his son be his own man. And I think that's a good thing. And they have a couple of really powerful and hard conversations. I'm sure the fact that Adrian isn't there to kind of mitigate circumstances between the two of them, I'm sure that is one of the reasons that they're having such a hard time. And look, Rocky, not always the most emotionally available person either, and I'm sure that Robert has acquired some of those characteristics as well, being a man of a certain age. So definitely some issues between Rocky and Robert, but I think it has a nice payoff for this movie. But it's worth noting, just like in real life, that they do come to some resolution, but very clearly is only a temporary one, as we learned in the Creed movies.
Yeah, all their sequences together are great, but that first part where they're in the meeting the boss and everything, yeah, man, that shows you he was just trying to make him his own man. But the thing is like Robert's character is, I don't know, there's this idea that this living in the shadow thing, and of course we've seen that in storylines and movies and wrestling and like, you know, celebrities and their children and nepotism and all these different things that come up. But like for him, like what Rocky's trying to tell him is that this shadow that you feel you're in, you created it yourself. You can still be your own man. You don't need me to compare to or whatever. But then Robert's telling him like, I can't escape it because you're so popular that everyone's just going to compare you to me. But that's kind of the struggle, because I understand both arguments. Like you sympathize for both, but I don't think there's quite a clear resolution of that problem, because it's just one of those things that's just gonna have to be dealt with for the rest of his life, Robert's life, because there may be a shadow in his eyes, but he can still be his own man. It's just he has to deal with the fact that he has to accept the fact that he's Rocky's son and all these things that come with it. And Rocky, you know, probably didn't want that for his son, but he's just, you know, trying to teach him to be his own man. So there's that struggle there that really works out, or it really like comes well off the screen, like from the page to screen. And I think that interaction, well, we'll talk about it a bit, but I love the interaction later on in the sidewalk. But this was a good little setup and kind of shows you where Rocky's at, because he just wants to have dinner with his son. You know what I mean?
Well, before we move on, I think now is actually a good time, because I'm going to talk about this in terms of the relationships that he has with kind of each character. So what is it about that sidewalk scene that you enjoy so much? Because I think for a lot of people, it's like it's this huge motivational talk, and it's very oft quoted, especially when he talks about like the idea that it doesn't matter how many times you get hit, but how many times you get up. Like, this is a huge, almost cliche at this point. So what is it about that sidewalk scene? I mean, it's like it's Sylvester Stallone's Oscar moment, I would say.
Well, for me, like, that's always been my personal mantra, is just keep moving forward. So I don't know if I subconsciously got it from this movie or just like picked up on it, but that's always been my personal mantra. So what he's trying to say is like, I get it, man, because I have a lot of friends that can easily get down and just kind of get down on themselves and don't want to move forward. They just want to stay there. So I try to motivate them to keep moving forward. And this is what Rocky's trying to tell his son, man. So I get it. And that scene is like so like, I don't know, because maybe it's just shot outside and the background is this urban setting, and the fact that like it's just this real conversation, it works out so well. And I love that scene. And I know a lot of people quote it or whatnot, but it's easily quotable. But it's one of those things that I think is true to life. Like, if you just kind of like hold yourself back and don't want to continue, you're just going to be like in a rut. You know what I mean? You got to keep moving forward no matter what happens. And that's always been my motive. Like, that's always been my personal like quote, motive, mantra, whatever you want to call it. So I totally relate to this scene. And, you know, it sucks because like I don't think Robert does that, because he ends up like in a strained relationship with his father again years later. So it's really like one of those things that comes from probably like real life and those talks he had with his real life son. And yeah, I think it's just one of those things that just translates to real world or real life situations so much that people just grasp onto it. You know what I mean?
I mean, in canon, his father gets cancer and he doesn't come home to help take care of him. It's up to Adonis Creed to do it. So I think that is certainly something that is worth noting. But one of the important scenes at the end of Creed 2 is Rocky going to visit his son and grandson in Vancouver. And I'm not sure that we're ever going to see Rocky again and seeing him, like, what happens after that. But it is, I just wanted to point that out. So Rocky and Paulie are struggling. Paulie is, of course, Adrian's sister, played by Burt Young, who is still with us, as Brian loves to point out. Paulie is very bitter about the bad relationship that he has with his sister. I have to say, if you rewatch the Rocky movies, I think you will be surprised at how racist, misogynistic, and just an overall terrible person that Paulie is. Like, he is awful.
I've realized that for years, and I've always interpreted it as like that, that asshole uncle in the family or that asshole aunt in the family.
He is that one. He's like, he's your Billy Carter. He's the Clinton brother that was kind of crazy. Like, he's that guy. So I did know. I can't believe I've never noticed this, Brian. But this is the first time on this viewing that I noticed that Paulie was painting pictures. I had never noticed that before. And this very clearly has to do with the fact that Burt Young is a real life painter. And so we see him painting a little bit throughout this movie. He is fired from his meat packing job. And there's even a moment when Paulie sneaks Rocky in to punch the meat, as he did in the first one. I'm glad that this movie is under 2 hours. I'm glad that it's like 1 hour and 40 minutes and done. I really wish we had gotten a little bit more of Rocky punching the meat and how they kind of snuck in. I think that would have been really amusing. And I genuinely love that Paulie gives this very emotional speech. He kind of does it in every movie, but I think this one is particularly good, giving that speech just before the fight.
Yeah. Something about Paulie, man, I don't know what it is, but like seeing him, just knowing that he's alive, and I keep mentioning that just because if you look at him in this role, it looks like he's on the verge of death already. And I hate to say that, but I don't know if it's just his lifestyle or whatever. But man, it looks like he had it rough, not just the fictional character, but the actual person. And he's still alive, man. So I don't know. Credit to him because he looked rough, like rough. And then when he said that he finally retired, I just laughed out loud, like, dude, you should have retired a long time ago, man. But yeah, and I noticed that I don't know. At first, when I saw with the meat, I was like, what the fuck is he doing? Is he delivering this meat to the restaurant or whatever? And then I realized he stole it. Yeah, that's Paulie, man. He'll just do whatever, and that's kind of my interpretation of the character, is that asshole uncle or whatever. And I mean, he's really mean to Adrian. Let's not forget that. But in a way, he is kind of like one of the few connections left to Adrian, you know what I mean? Other than his son. But yeah, seeing Paulie and giving that speeches and all that kind of thing, and him just being like grizzled and like just same old Paulie, man. Just I loved it. And then when I know you mentioned him being racist, man. That Indian joke was like so like out of left field. Do you have a reservation? What do I look like, an Indian? Like, wow, dude, wow. But again, that's that asshole uncle that you kind of just had like, oh, okay.
I think if you want to see Paulie really be racist, watch Rocky 3, and boy, oh boy, will you be in for it. So in terms of relationships, we kind of go back 30 years. We have a young girl named Marie, is somebody that Rocky yelled at to basically do better for herself. Now it's 30 years later. Marie comes back into Rocky's life. And so for me, I always get the impression that Marie like moved and came back with the teenage son, because if Rocky's very clearly been in the neighborhood for all this time. So the idea that they would not see each other before this would be kind of ridiculous. I guess there was a point in the Rocky 5 script when Marie was going to be a prostitute and drugged out and homeless. And I'm really glad we didn't get that. Rocky bonds with Marie in a father-daughter way, and also is a mentor to Marie's son, who we know as Steps. The Rocky and Steps bond over buying an old dog, as the dog and Rocky have a lot in common with them being old and not wanting to move very much. And Marie also temporarily works the front of Adrian's, as well as the first server is pregnant. I do have to say, I was looking for the actor's name, who was the original server. I don't know if you noticed this, Brian, but there's a lot of eye rolling. There's a lot of I get the impression that she is very annoyed at her existence in Rocky's life and dealing with Paulie and dealing with all the bullshit. Did that come across to you?
The pregnant lady, the server?
Yes, the pregnant server.
Yeah. I think she's just used to Paulie and just annoyed as fuck with him. That's what I think that is, because like she's been there for a while, obviously, and Paulie's been just coming in randomly and just doing whatever the fuck he wants, and I think that's where that annoying comes from, like that annoyance, because like I think it's all comes from Paulie, because you can even tell when he walks in and Marie's there, and Marie's like, "Who the fuck is this guy?" And he calls over Rocky, like he's just being an asshole. So I understand that annoyance, and that's just Paulie. I think it all comes from Paulie.
Absolutely. Your feelings on the Marie-Rocky relationship, which in some ways is Murray's not necessarily stepping in for Adrian, because this is much more of a mentor relationship, but it's kind of giving us an opportunity for him to interact with somebody.
Yeah, it's just
is a woman.
I don't know. It feels like Stallone's writing Rocky as some kind of like Jesus figure and looking out for all these people, which is fine. Like I get it, and I like that their relationship kind of like develops in that kind of way. And what I wanted more was Robert, his son, and her son to kind of like have more interactions, because that's kind of what I think I wanted more from Creed 2 that just they didn't have time for. Is that I wanted to see Apollo and Robert like interact and talk about being the sons of like these great legends, because I think that'd be a fascinating conversation to have, and it's not too late to have that conversation. But I mean, you never know with Creed 3. He might just sneak in there and have Robert come in or something like that. But that's kind of like what I kind of wanted is like seeing the kids talk about they're having these legendary figures, you know, in their life, and doing like, oh man, you're the son of Rocky Balboa. What was that like? And that's kind of what I wanted. But they never got that. I mean, they acknowledge each other during the training sequence, but that was it. So, and then Marie's character is fine. It's just I don't know why she didn't come back in Creed. I guess it was not necessary, but I don't know. It just seems kind of like open-ended, like kind of like it's almost like they started an arc for her, but just didn't complete it because Stallone doesn't really know how to write female characters with an arc. So that's kind of the issue that I have with the characters. Like she's kind of there as like just to kind of like be to serve Rocky's character in terms of what Rocky needs emotionally. And, she does need some help, like, money wise and emotionally wise too, but she's more there to serve Rocky's purposes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that is a very, very good point on your part. Now, we've talked about the individual relationships that Rocky has with the different characters, but the overall premise of the movie is the idea that boxing is a dying sport, which is kind of a shoot. I think I think that Stallone kind of misses the point, because I think money is a huge part of the problem. But from a narrative standpoint within the movie, the idea is the boxers don't have the same heart as Rocky. I think the problem is a lot more nuanced than that. There are some awful promoters, which you do see represented in the movie, basically chasing the money and chasing these gimmicks, as opposed to focusing on putting on the best fights. And I think MMA has taken a lot of the steam away from boxing. And boxing, I think, I'm not going to say it's had a resurgence in popularity, but I do think that it has become a little bit more mainstream, back with more fights on ESPN and things of that nature. But I still don't think it's ever going to be as big as it was in the 1970s, in the 1980s. And so Mason the Line Dixon, which is a god-awful name, is played by boxer Antonio Tarver. This is, boxers have had, they've been in Rocky movies before. We had Joe Frazier with a cameo in the first one, The Philadelphia Connection. We had Roberto Duran in the second one. We had Tommy Morrison in Rocky V playing Tommy Gunn. That I don't think necessarily worked out very well. And I think Antonio Tarver is a better actor than Tommy Morrison. But I can't help but think, especially with Creed 3 coming out, and obviously Jonathan Majors would have been too young in 2006 to have done this, but I can't help but think, like, if Jonathan Majors was Mason Dixon, how much better this movie would be. Because Antonio Tarver he's not a seasoned actor, and I think the scenes with him and Stallone are pretty clunky. Like, as much as the Marie character is not a real character, I think Geraldine Hughes is giving a performance, and she is able to bounce off Stallone really well, just like Burt Young, just like Emilio Ventimiglia. I just don't see that with Tarver. And I do think that the main storyline, setting it up the way they do with this computer fight between Rocky and Mason Dixon, like, I think that works out. It's as good of a gimmick as any to get these two in this exhibition fight. But Brian, there is an aspect of this that I know you were very excited to perhaps discuss even briefly, with the person who criticizes Rocky. Like, how could anyone criticize Rocky? Of course, a certain sports blabber could do it.
Are we talking about Max Kellerman here? Or
we're talking Skip Bayless.
Oh, Skip. Oh, that's right. I forgot about his cameo already. So yeah, we got a Skip Bayless cameo, and he said some things recently. Well, I guess his whole career he's just said shit, and yeah, I don't know if it's a work or not. Like, I don't know the Skip Bayless gimmick. I don't know if he truly means the things he says or tweets. I don't know, but in this case, he was, on the Sports Center or whatever in 2006, and because it's 2006, we said Woody Page. Shout out to Woody Page for being one of the more normal analysts around that time. He's not nearly as popular anymore, but Woody Page was very entertaining in comparison to Skip Bayless. But Skip, of course, is talking shit, and he's just talking shit, Yeah, Skip Bayless, man. What can you say? He's I don't know if he's a gimmick or not, man, but he pisses everyone off, and I don't know how Fox pays him the money he's getting when his ratings are just in the toilet all the time. But that's a whole nother discussion for a whole nother podcast. But yeah, just Skip Bayless, man. What a trip. Because he actually looks the same as he does now in 2006. So,
dude, Skip Bayless is pretty buff. Like, I don't know if you've seen him like working out and stuff, but like he is very much in shape. And for all that we could criticize him, I mean, he is definitely a man that keeps himself well put together. But of course, he is also a complete asshole. But enough of that. Let's talk about the ending fight. So the idea of the fight is, you can't have Rocky take a beating, right? You can't have Rocky with his eyes shut and like where Mick has to cut him like in the first one. You can't have him taking an extensive amount of headshots. So I think the fight is just really awkward, because what ends up happening is you can't have Rocky like dying, but you also can't have him plausibly beat the heavyweight champion. So I think they kind of come up with this happy medium, and I'm not a huge fan of how Stallone shoots boxing. I definitely, you look at Rocky 5, Rocky 4 especially, I think it's a bit of a problem. I think Ryan Coogler is just a superior filmmaker in this area in terms of how boxing is shot. But the ending is, Mason Dixon winning by split decision. But just like in the first one, the idea is not necessarily that Rocky needs to win, but that he needs to just kind of go the distance and kind of prove himself and get everything that was in the basement out. And he does. And he kind of gets to end things on his own terms. Like, that's the biggest thing that this movie is setting up. And the idea is that, he had to retire after the fight with Drago, but he was forced into retirement. And here he is coming back for one more fight, kind of one last hurrah. And he is doing it on his terms. So a very nice payoff. And yeah, I have a couple more things that I want to highlight in the strengths, but that's kind of how everything pays off.
See, for me, what really just kind of questions the whole thing is that because Mason the Lion Dixon breaks his left hand in the fight in the second round, then it's like, oh yeah, he's weak now. Then it became an even fight. So for me, is like, was it really like the fight that Rocky wanted? You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't an even fight at that point, right? Like, technically, it was a handicap at that point, and therefore it made it even. So I don't know. For me, it looked like, this is just from like a sports perspective, right? He goes down twice in the first round. At that rate, he would have got a TKO. He would have been knocked down 3 times in that second or third round because he couldn't keep up with the pace, right? So I don't know, man. I just question, like, why even do the injury? Like, if you really wanted to prove himself, why give Mason the Line Dixon this handicap? And I've always questioned that, because then he goes, of course, to 10 rounds, and because like the dude's hurt. But Max Kellerman is on the commentary being like, well, because he's got a broken hand, he can hit harder now because he's not going to feel anything. And I keep thinking, like, I think in 2023 they would have stopped the fight. They would have just stopped the fight because the dude's got a broken hand. Now, in UFC, I think they started doing that more as well, where they're taking more injuries into account and stopping fights because obviously, hindsight, you got to protect the fighters. You know what I mean? And I don't know, in this case, you're protecting the fighter, but it's a Rocky movie, but it's 2000. You know what I mean? It's like, it's a lot of questions that I have about this fight. And I keep saying, like, I think this movie didn't need a fight at all. Like, it just should have been some kind of resolution in some dramatic way. You know what I mean? Without the fight. Maybe I think the better ending would have been him realizing he shouldn't fight and just not turn the fight down. And that would have been the more adult thing to do. But in this case, he kind of wrote himself an out where it's like, okay, I'm going to injure the guy in the match and therefore give Rocky the even fight that he wants. But it felt like, so like, okay, we're going to have to cheat our way to get this guy an even fight at 60 years old against the heavyweight champion.
Yeah, the broken hand doesn't necessarily bother me. I think it just creates this plausibility. But I do agree that if there was a way for there to not be a fight, I think it could have worked out it even better. And so the strengths of this movie, to me, I love the fact that this is a movie that's 1 hour and 45 minutes. I think perfect timing. I think deleting the scenes they did, if this was a 2.5 hour movie, I don't think it works. I think it's perfect as is. I love the fact that Sylvester Stallone gets to spend so much of the movie just talking with Burt Young and Milo Ventimiglia and Geraldine Hughes. I think that's when the movie's at its best, when it's in the restaurant, around the restaurant, that kind of thing. The seediness of the promoters, I love that aspect of it. And I think that's not necessarily quote unquote plot, but just how awful they are as human beings, I think works out really well. The music, which is going to play a role in what I discuss later, bringing in Bill Conti, what a legend. I mean, it makes such a difference.
It's his last movie too. His last movie he ever did a score for.
He is still with us, but he has not composed music for any movie since this one. I love that this takes place Philadelphia in the winter. The fact that it feels much more like the original. And unlike every other sequel, which shows the ending of the previous movie, this movie does not even acknowledge Rocky V, and that is for the best. I have one more strength I want to discuss, but I'm saving that for last. Any other strengths you want to mention?
We're pretty much in agreement on everything there. And I will say this, even though I wasn't a big fan of the fight, I do love the idea of him walking out before they even announced the winner of the fight, because that does show that he just wanted to go the distance, and I get that. But I love that visual of him walking away from the ring because that's his last fight. And just something about, seeing a wrestler or a fighter having their last match or fight and walking away from the ring. It's kind of one of those iconic things. I think of Terry Funk, even though he retired God knows how many times, but it just kind of reminds you of Terry Funk, you know what I mean? And Sting, obviously, and Ric Flair's and all these, legendary wrestlers that try to have a comeback. I mentioned Bob Backlund before. But man, I do love that visual of him walking away from the ring. That's very symbolic, and that's the last thing we see in the movie, pretty much, other than the montage at the end credits. But I love that visual at the end.
So the best moment in the movie, we don't have a lot of Duke, which Duke is old. I get it. But the speech that Duke gives, and I'm saving this on its own because it is my absolute favorite part of the movie. So he gives this speech, and it is what you hear at the beginning of this episode. So I'm not going to repeat it. I'm not going to try to perform it. The fact that speech then leads directly into the training montage is absolutely incredible. Again, Duke gets like 6 lines. Boy, does he make them count. I can't tell you how much I love this. It's by far the best thing in the movie for me.
And I do love, it's like this, the whole speech is kind of this metaphor of aging. And that's kind of what it is, because like he's telling Rocky, you can't go toe-to-toe with the guy. You're too old. So what we're going to have to do is try to make your punches so hard that you break something. on accident or something. So I get it, man. It's just that it's more or less about what the physicality of it is, but it's more of a sense of the metaphorical nature of it all, where it's just like you're gonna have to outsmart the guy. You're gonna have to do this. You're gonna have to do that. You can't rely on your physical prowess anymore, so to speak. And you're just gonna have to adapt and try to figure out a way to beat this guy with pure power and strength because that's all you got left. So I dig that, man. And we talk about it. This actor before, I loved him in the added stuff they added in Rocky IV. I felt like they added more to his character with the deleted scenes they added for the director's cut in that one. And of course, he had that small role in Assault on Precinct 13. So of course, much love to his acting prowess. But man, he sure knows how to deliver a speech well, because even the speech that was deleted and they added in Rocky IV, when he's not a speech, but this kind of like dialogue he's having with Rocky in Russia about how since Creed died, I'm going to be your trainer now, and you're going to represent me, and not, that they establish this relationship that kind of gets swept under the rug. But I'm glad they bring it back in this one because it reminds you of Creed and that whole relationship they had and the way they came together at the end of Rocky IV.
For sure. Not too many weaknesses to go over. I think Antonio Tarver is a weakness. I don't think he's terrible, but I don't think he's really adding anything. And the fact that we have almost no investment in his character compared to Creed or even Clubber Lang, I think is really unfortunate. So the commentators are the real HBO boxing commentators: Jim Lampley, Max Kellerman, and Larry Merchant. Larry Merchant is really terrible. It sounds like he's reading lines off a cue card. It absolutely does not work in any conceivable way.
But doesn't Larry Merchant sound like that all the time? It feels like he's always been the boring guy. Like, it's always been that other guy, the main guy, who's got the life in the boxing fights. At least that's what I remember.
I can't say that I watch a lot of boxing on HBO, so it's hard for me to really say that. I'm just talking about in this movie he's bad. Max Kellerman and Jim Lampley I think are good. Like, I think it actually sounds like they are enthusiastic and like they're actually calling a boxing match, and Max Kellerman seems actually excited to be calling a Rocky Balboa fight, so I appreciated that. Unfortunately, there was no acknowledgement of Apollo Creed due to some issues with Carl Weathers. That thankfully we got more Carl Weathers, more Apollo Creed in the Creed movies, thankfully. The way the movie addresses brain damage and concussions probably isn't great. And the stuff with steps is just kind of weird. I don't like it. Doesn't totally work for me. Any other weaknesses, Brian? Anything else about anything that you didn't like?
Well, I'd mentioned already that I wish there wasn't a fight, but I did mention that I thought it was shot well for the HBO crew to come in and actually do the filming because the cameras switched. Because I would say around that time, a lot of directors were experimenting with digital cinematography and switching between, old 35 millimeter and digital in the same movie. I think, I don't know. There's some directors at the time that were doing it. Richard Linklater, I think, was doing it at the time as well. But, I love that contrast. And, the thing with Sylvester Stallone when he's writing a movie is that he can't write female characters well, and that's kind of the issue. And thank God someone came in, and Ryan Coogler came in and kind of fixed that problem and gave us some really good female characters in the Creed franchise. But that's the one weakness I've noticed, especially with the Adrian stuff in the sequels, and it's kind of a continuation here, where the female character is more of a service to Rocky as opposed to having her own arc. But yeah, and I just wish that they kind of had more of a resolution with her arc and what she was even there for, and him and Robert, not really having resolution, even though Robert does kind of become part of the team. It's just we kind of want to know what triggered that gap in time where they didn't see each other for, like, I don't know, 8 years or whatever it was. So there's kind of that lingering, leftover, unfinished, storyline that kind of bothers me a little bit. But other than that, it's pretty much, all the good stuff is the sidewalk scene and the restaurant stuff and, the grounded stuff that takes place more in the city and less the stuff that takes place in Vegas.
All right, the MVP is Bill Conti. Is there any possible way you could disagree with me on this?
I got to go with Stallone because Stallone wrote that awesome speech that lives true in my life every day. I don't know whether I got it from him or not, but I was definitely living that kind of mantra before I saw the movie. But I got to go because, I mean, despite his writing flaws with female characters, he wrote some awesome speeches in this movie. I got to give him credit for.
I am giving Stallone best performance, but to me, the music is what makes a Rocky movie, and to me, it's Bill Conti. Is this underrated? Absolutely. I give this an 8 out of 10. I think having the two Creed movies actually helps this movie in a lot of ways, because I think it gives Rocky a proper ending in terms of he really does become Mickey. Like, he really does kind of circle back around back to the original in the Creed movie. So I think that only makes this movie better. So for me, this is absolutely underrated. And like, in some ways, I think you could almost watch Rocky and then watch this movie and just completely skip out on the other sequels.
I mean, that's one way to do it. I definitely think it's underrated. If I were to kind of put other underrated Rocky sequels in there, I might say Rocky 2, because I feel like that one gets kind of like brushed over a lot as well. But it's just more of an extension of the first one, and it's just kind of like, I would say Rocky 2 is more like 60 minutes of stalling until we get to the rematch. But still, I feel like that's kind of underrated in its own sense. But this is definitely underrated because I feel like people think of the fight at the end when they think of this movie, and the fight with Tarver and him being 60 years old. That's what kind of throws people off. But if you look at what the first hour presents to you and that grounded feel, that's the Rocky that we all kind of love from the first one. So yeah, it's definitely underrated in that sense. And I'm glad that Ryan Coogler grounded it, or kept it grounded in Creed 1 and 2. And I think that's why I love those sequels so much more than a lot of the other Rocky sequels. But yeah, when Rocky's grounded and he's not doing the 80s excess stuff, that's where he's at his best. Even though a lot of people love Rocky 4 for what it is, and so do I. But to get to the real heart of the character, you got to get to that street level, and that's what this movie does.
So we're talking about one 80s action star this week. We are going to be talking about another 80s star next week, Brian. I know this is a movie that you're really dreading, but Brian, this is I'm making you do it. I am making you watch a movie that you promised you would never watch.
Well, at least it has a tie into the modern what's going on, because what is it, Diego Luna? Is that the right Luna?
Gabriel. It's Gabriel.
Gabriel Luna is a star on The Last of Us right now. That's on HBO. That's got everyone talking. So great timing, Jerome, because he is the Terminator in this one, is he not?
Yes, he is. He is going to be in that. So it's going to be really interesting just to see how this all turns out. I am so curious to see what your thoughts are on this movie, because I think it could go in a number of different directions. I think this franchise has had a lot of problems, which we will get into next week.
His fate, so to speak, next week.
Anyway, for Brian, I'm Jerome. Thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you again next week.
So should we just play the clip of Terry Funk going forever, forever, and, just play that out?
All right. So there we go.
If you want to play